Record this. All right, so we're going to dive into today's lecture. So it's going to be biodiversity loss and conservation. So, um, kind of a sad topic. um, I don't know. The next couple classes are just kind of sad. But I guess kind of the classes we've already talked about before are a little bit sad too. But this one is definitely sad because this one is just talking about how we lose biodiversity on this planet, which is just kind of a sad thing overall. So if you have any questions as we're going through this, obviously you can speak, you can unmute yourself. I just, like I said, I muted people because I could hear ESPN in the background or something like ESPN, and I can also see the chat. So if you want to dump something in the chat too, because I confused you or something like that, just give me a heads up. All right. So the question we're going to sort of keep in the back of our mind and uh, think about throughout this is why do we protect a polar bear? Right? Polar bears are not just the sort of you know adorable species that they are. I mean, they're clearly adorable. I mean, look at these cubs, but they're not just like this high profile species, right? They're not just like a sexy species that people use to try to, guilt people into thinking about climate change or biodiversity loss, right? There is an actual reason we're going to discuss today is why we in particular care about a polar bear, why we care about biodiversity as a topic. And so I've been throwing around biodiversity, and I realize I haven't explained that, but I think that the name itself really does explain it quite nicely. Bio meaning life, and diversity meaning how many different things do I have, right? So in a sociological context, right? So or thinking like demographics, right? Diversity is just how many different types of ethnicities, religions I have, right? In a biological context, i.e., biodiversity, it's thinking about how much species I have. And this exists at three distinct levels. It exists at the genetic level, the species level, and the ecosystem level. Now, the species level is the easiest to understand. So if we're thinking about, in this case, we have a Canadian wilderness, um, and we have species diversity, just how many species do I have? End of story. That makes it really simple. Now, ecosystem diversity is a slightly more complex, but ecosystem diversity ties into how many different ecosystems do I have in a defined area. So if I'm looking at this plot of Canada, I have boreal forests and parklands and grasslands and mountains and foothills, right? That's a lot of different types of environments, right? In contrast, I could just have one type of environment here, in which I'd have very low ecosystem biodiversity. And then the kind of the funky one to understand, and it depends on how much you like, regular biology, but genetic diversity is an interesting one because when you look at us, any population, even the human population, right? The traits or the physical features of a population are not uniform. And so when you look at a group of humans, we all vary, right? We have different eye color, different hair color, different heights, different weights, right? Those are all traits. But to have that trait, there's some underlying genetic diversity to that. You have to have something in your DNA to give rise to your traits. And so when we're thinking about genetic diversity at the biodiversity level, it's how much different types of genetic material, like variations in genes, do I have within a population? And as a general rule, before I sort of move on, the more genetic diversity you have, the better, because you have more traits. And if something bad happens, the more traits you have, the more likely you are to, as a ecosystem or a population, to survive that bad thing that's happening. So if you have a drought, for instance, and you have lots of genetic diversity, you're more likely as a population to survive because there's likely some underlying genetic trait that gives you an advantage under, say, a drought. So that's the idea. Again, it's the harder of the three to understand, but it is definitely very, very important. Um, and I have a friend that works on this idea, and she works on plants, and she shows all the time that plants that have higher genetic diversity in their populations do better once you smack them with something bad, like floods or salt or predators or something like that. But the sort of the bottom line for biodiversity is we couldn't really live without it. And that's the reality of it. Without biodiversity, we can't get those four provisioning services that we discussed earlier in the semester. Without biodiversity, we do not get natural resources to take, right? We don't get food, water, right? We don't get purification of our air or soil. We don't get tourism and aesthetic pleasure, right? We don't get all those key provisioning services that nature provides for us. And so ecosystems that are natural, that are not majorly human disturbed, provide the most ecosystem services. And as we discussed, remember those ecosystem services have a whopping 120 trillion plus dollar value to us. So biodiversity and money are tied together hand in hand. And again, it's tied hand in hand because a healthy biodiverse ecosystem provides food, provides timber, provides water filtration, purification, flood control, provides all these things. And as we saw with the Florida Everglades, right, even with something like tourism, like recreational fishing, billions of dollars a year to us, right? So it provides a lot to us. And again, it's just at the price of having a lot of species diversity and a lot of ecosystem diversity and a lot of genetic diversity. So as I sort of alluded to when I talked about the biodiversity lab, biodiversity is found everywhere. Right? Biodiversity is all around you. And even, just as a note, even inside your body, you're teeming with hundreds of species of bacteria, right? So you are as a self a very biodiverse ecosystem, even though you don't probably want to think about that. So biodiversity is everywhere, right? Even on Bentley's campus, it's everywhere, right? And so there are regions of the world where biodiversity is very, very high. And these are typically, I'll show you a map of it in a second, but they're typically around the tropics, islands, things like that. And places that have very high biodiversity typically have very high numbers of what we call endemic species. And endemic species, or endemism as a sort of a idea, is that species that are native to a particular area, but typically aren't found anywhere else. So for instance, the Florida manatee, um, this handsome guy, or actually, sorry, so this handsome, beautiful lady over here and her cub, I think it's called a cub. I don't know what you call a manatee kid. There's probably a technical term for it, but you see them covered in algae, and I think that's adorable. Um, and the Florida manatee is only found in the Florida Everglades. It's found nowhere else. It's endemic to the Florida Everglades. Fun fact about manatees, and you can't really see it in these pictures. Well, actually, you can kind of see it right here. Is actually manatees actually have fingers. They have fingernails. Um, so if you look up manatee fingernails, they actually have fingernails still. It's a remnant of their evolutionary past because all marine mammals, like dolphins and manatees and whales, they came from an ancestor that was living on land back, and they came back into the ocean. So they have a remnant of their land ancestor as fingernails. It's weird, but it's cool. It's a cool thing if you have 5 minutes to dive down a rabbit hole of manatee fingernails. But as I mentioned, biodiversity exists typically in confined areas. It's all around us, but there are hotspots, right, where there's lots and lots of species diversity. And they exist both in terrestrial as well as marine habitats. So in this map of the planet, blue is marine. So we have, off the coast of Mexico, here out here by Hawaii, all the way around. And then we have lots of terrestrial biodiversity hotspots. And there's ones that make sense, right? The Amazon rainforest, right? The lush jungles of Southeast Asia and the islands, right? One you might not think of, the Mediterranean, right? Huge spots of South America. Madagascar in itself is a biodiversity hotspot, right? So they're everywhere. And I should also mention that Florida Everglades are also a biodiversity hotspot. But they're sort of everywhere. But where they are typically found are places that are particularly warm, right? The Mediterranean's warm. Pretty much all of Africa is warm, right? This is warm, 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 right? So biodiversity hotspots are typically found in places that are warm. And does anybody know why that might be? I think it's sort of a weird concept to think about, but does anybody know why warm places typically have more biodiversity? And remember, I muted you, so if you're gonna try to talk, you're muted. And if you want to type in the chat, that's okay too. Well, Places like the tropics, they have a much more stable climate. Places that have a very stable climate can have typically have more biodiversity because they don't have crazy seasons. Like right here in New England, right, we have crazy seasons, right? We go from, you know, usually really heavy snow and ice in the winter, and then we go to hot, humid summers, right? Then we have that crazy swing, right? And that's not stable. But the tropics, pretty stable. The Mediterranean, right? It's pretty stable. And that stability breeds, not in the sense of like actual breeding, but like, makes biodiversity more likely, high biodiversity, that is. So, so let's dive into. So the United States Endangered Species Act was enacted in 1973 in response to multiple sort of high-profile species becoming extinct. But when we're trying to find an endangered species, it's something that is in danger of becoming extinct throughout all or a significant proportion of its range. Now, what is extinction? Well, extinction just means that species won't be found on the planet anymore, right? So lots and lots of species have gone extinct, right? The dinosaurs, right? The dodo bird, the passenger pigeon, which we talked about earlier this semester, right? They've gone extinct. So no longer found on the planet. Now, there is, I will mention about extinction because this is an important thing to note, is there is what we call a background level of extinction, right? Extinctions are happening all the time. That's just a natural process on the planet. As the planet changes, if things can't adapt to the new planet, they go extinct. So it is a natural thing, just as a note. But when we're thinking about, sort of the Anthropocene, we're thinking about things that are being put to extinction because of humans, right? Because of our activities. Just wanted to make note of that because it's an important thing. It's always important to sort of understand the full issue, right? So when we talk about climate change, we'll understand the full issue, not just one side or the other. And so with species extinctions, again, there is that background extinction risk. But that, again, that's a natural thing, not an anthropogenic thing. So that's our endangered species. They're threatened of becoming extinct. Now, a threatened species is a species that likely is to become in danger within the foreseeable future. And an example of of an endangered species, and this one is critically endangered, is the vaquita. It's I always think this picture, it looks kind of devious. If you look at its eyes and its mouth, it looks kind of devious to me, but I digress. And this is critically endangered according to the World Wildlife Foundation. Very few exist in the wild right now. I think it's like a couple hundred of this marine mammal exist. And then we have the West Indian manatee, distinct from our Florida manatee, which exists obviously in the region of India. It is threatened, so it's heading towards extinction or being endangered, but it's not quite there yet. But in terms of what our endangered species list in the United States looks like now, and they do vary depending on how the country defines endangered. But a lot of species that are endangered in one country are endangered across pretty much all countries. So just as a note. Now, as of last year, the ESA, or the Endangered Species Act, does protect more than 1,600 plant and animal species, which is a lot, but we're pretty destructive as a as a species. And 99% of the species placed on the endangered species list have not gone extinct, and that's pretty good, right? Something that is on the sort of precipice of going extinct. Highest priority on our endangered species, and so the New York Times reports this last year, and they says the government will now consider economic factors before characterizing a species as endangered or threatened. And so they say for the first time, regulators would be allowed to conduct economic assessments, for instance, estimating lost revenue from a prohibition on logging in a critical habitat when deciding whether a species warrants protection. And that's sort of putting the economy sort of ahead of biodiversity, and you can have a mixed opinion on that. Some people will argue that losing one species isn't a big deal. Others will argue the exact opposite. So you can have your opinion on that as you will. But ultimately, when something makes it on the endangered species list, either as endangered, critically endangered, or threatened, it does get afforded some protections. So if you're trying to build something, if you're trying to do anything, you have to account for the presence of a potentially endangered species, and it might actually prevent you from actually doing what you're trying to do. So if you pretend the Florida manatee is endangered, well, if you want to build a housing development and it might impact the Florida manatee, the Endangered Species Act says you physically can't, which is a good thing. But if you're able to consider economic factors now, that's not exactly the best thing for this species list. In addition, species that have been categorized as threatened actually don't receive the same protections. And so the protections have to be established on a case-by-case basis. Again, tying back to this idea of the economy. And there's been some pretty substantial changes about the language about threats to species in the foreseeable future, and allows regulators to avoid evaluating how climate change may have long-term consequences, because as we'll discuss, climate change is also going to impact biodiversity. And sort of our current status of the Endangered Species Act um, is pretty hampered relative to what it was prior to the current administration, which is kind of a bummer, because as you can see, 99% success rate of keeping things from going extinct is pretty good. So it was a pretty good piece of legislation that was put forth, and it has been substantially hampered by the current administration, unfortunately. So, and again, it's important because once something makes it onto that list, if it doesn't go extinct, that's a good thing, right? Even if it's just one species, that's still a good thing. And because extinction itself is, as this quote says, is forever. But if something is endangered, it means you still have time. It means you still have time to try to rescue it, to try to fix the mistakes that humans have made, right? And that's an important aspect of the endangered species list. By putting something on there, you recognize there's a problem, and you try to fix that problem. And that's a good thing. And again, it prevents extinction. So, for instance, the Steller sea cow was hunted to extinction in the 1700s, only 27 years after being discovered by Europeans. So it was a nice, tasty, fatty treat for them. Um, and that's the Steller sea cow is just one of many examples. But you can also look at some pretty great success stories from the endangered species list. So, for instance, the right whale was hunted to nearly extinction in the 1800s, and it came back after it was placed on the endangered species list in the 1900s. So, it does overall work. Now, Patrick drove the snakes out of Ireland, because rattlesnakes are dangerous, right? And so we locally extirpated rattlesnakes from Massachusetts, but we still know that rattlesnakes exist elsewhere, right, in the United States and elsewhere as well. So two definition things here. So that's the endangered species list. Let's switch gears slightly and think about worldwide things. And so we're going to look at a 2019 global assessment report from our friends at the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity. I will make a note that biodiversity loss is pegged at one of the biggest issues of our time by the UN in terms of security threats and economic threats and things like that. So just as a FYI. Now, inside this assessment, and again, you can just Google this title if you want to read the full thing, but I brought the highlights here that are important for us to understand. And so what they said is, due to anthropogenic activities, we've seen a decline in the biodiversity, and it's eroding the foundation of our economies, livelihoods, food security, health, and quality of life worldwide. So that's a pretty dire warning from the UN, right? It's eroding economies, people's lives, food security, health, and I should also mention it's eroding water security as well. That's a pretty big assessment, right? That's a pretty big deal. That's a lot, right? That's a lot of stuff. And again, it just shows you how important biodiversity is for everything, right? It ties directly into the economy, it ties directly into food security, water security, right? It's a pretty big deal. Currently, there's about 1.4 to 1.8 million species identified scientifically, and there are currently many, many more to be identified, so that we estimate there's about 6 million to 8 million species on this planet. And currently, there's about 1 million plant and animal species that are threatened with extinction on this planet. Now, if you just say it's 2 million, that implies 50% of all life on this planet is threatened, which is a lot. Which is a lot, right? 50%. It's a lot. 82% of all wild mammal biomass is gone. And so in terms of biomass, we're just looking at living tissue, right? And that's just, the mass of cows, right? Humans and farm animals actually make up 96% of all mammalian biomass on the planet. So 4% of all mammalian biomass is just things living naturally in the wild. 40% of amphibians are actually threatened with extinction. And this is a sort of actually a double-edged sword for our amphibian friends here. Climate change is beating them up pretty bad, but actually what's killing amphibians mostly is a pathogenic fungus called chytrid. And if that sparks your interest, if you Google chytrid fungus, you'll learn about how chytrid fungus is basically causing the extinction of upwards of 60% of all amphibian species globally right now. It's a really, really bad disease. We do know, and we'll discuss this coral idea later on, but we do know half corals have disappeared globally since the 19th century. A third of marine mammal species are threatened with extinction, and 10% of insect species are threatened with extinction. This number is actually a bit higher. There was a recent assessment that showed that it was closer to 40% of all insects are threatened with extinction. And that might not seem like a big deal, but remember, insects pollinate for us, not just natural trees, but our agriculture. So they provide, every year about $150 billion worth of value directly to farmers for free. So insect extinction is a really big deal. And so in addition to our endangered species list, we have the IUCN Red List, which is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And it's used as a guide to revise international agreements, such as the CITES, which is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, and it provides data to calculate the Red List Index, which is a biodiversity indicator used by the UN convention that we just talked about. And basically, it's just this list. You start off with, not evaluated or not enough data to make the assessment, and most species don't have enough data or haven't been evaluated, just as an FYI, even though many have, many haven't. And there's many species we just don't know that exist, so they can't be evaluated, right? But then we have least concern and near threatened, and these are things, stop, buddy. These are things, they're pretty cosmopolitan, right? A squirrel falls under least concern, right? Sparrows fall under least concern, right? Things that are, we have no concerns about them ever going extinct. They fall here. And then we move into the red list, which is vulnerable, endangered, critically endangered, extinct in the wild, and extinct. And so this is where things start to get sort of shifty. They enter our Endangered Species Act when they pass the vulnerable line here. But in terms of what this means, these ones are pretty straightforward. Extinction is pretty straightforward. Extinct in the wild means it only exists in either as a specimen in a zoo or an aquarium or something like that. So this is the list, and it does inform the United Nations, allows them to make the assessments that we just discussed here overall. But the reason we're sort of discussing how we define biodiversity and how we define conservation and how we define vulnerability is important, because as we discussed, the biodiversity is directly tied to the economy, right? It's tied directly to those 4 key services that ecosystems directly provide to us. And so economists do estimate that the loss of biodiversity alone in Europe, just in the EU, costs 3% of their total GDP per year. 3% of the GDP goes down the toilet because they've lost biodiversity every year. And it does increase every year as you destroy more and more biodiversity. Globally, and this is a really big number, Global biodiversity loss costs the United States, I'm sorry, costs the world about $15.5 trillion in American currency, which is just a ton of money. That's 10% of sort of the value of ecosystems worldwide, right? That's a lot of money. $15 trillion a year, which is crazy, crazy. Just by losing ecosystems, just by losing species, right? It's huge. Um, in terms of protecting the threatened species, we estimate that it costs between $4 and $76 billion to do. Not a lot of money. You know, it's not even 1/10 of the United States military budget just to protect all the species on the planet. So it's not a lot at all. But look at the ROI on this, right? 76 billion with the potential to restore 15 trillion. So the ROI, or the return on investment, that is super high, right? And I hope you sort of connect this back to restoring the Everglades, right? You're restoring ecosystems, right? You're restoring habitat, you're restoring species, and you get money back from that because they are, again, they're buddies. Our economies are directly tied to nature, and and again, and coronavirus shows that as well, right? We see coronavirus as a result of biodiversity loss, right? Destruction of habitats, putting animals closer to humans. And how much money has that cost our economy? How much does that cost global economies? Well, at least global economies that haven't done particularly well, right? Like South Korea is doing great, New Zealand's doing great, but we're not doing so great, and other countries aren't doing so great either. So it costs money just from the things it sort of reaps. And just to sort of show you, a really great assessment of the value of an ecosystem, we're going to compare a mangrove, which is these coastal forests. They're really cool. They have these roots that come up. They look like they're sitting on stilts, and they have these roots that come up out of the mud to get oxygen because the mud below is completely devoid of oxygen. And so that's what a mangrove is. And obviously, you guys have heard of a shrimp farm. You're growing shrimp for people to eat. But you can look at the value of a mangrove. It's upwards of $4,000 per hectare. Just as an FYI, a hectare is about 2.5 acres of land, just a scientific term for it. And you see that the coastal protection makes up about $3,800 of that 4,000. And then there's fish reserves and the food forestry production products, so timber mostly. And that makes up the $4,000 per hectare a mangrove's worth. And that's in contrast to a shrimp farm, which you only get about per hectare, about $200 per hectare for just selling the shrimp as a farmer. The rest of it comes from subsidies. So you're getting money from a governmental body to subsidize your farm. This is the same not just for shrimp farms. This is also the same for classical, like I grow corn or soybeans. And then there's the cost associated with pollution, right? That's the negative in your ledger, right? You have to pay for taking care of pollution. You have to pay for fines for pollution, right? And so it's pretty easy to see that the value nature provides, especially relative to something that is human made, right? Our farms. And this is not just for shrimp farms. This is true for pretty much all fisheries worldwide and agriculture, corn, soybeans, so on and so forth. Even very valuable things like something like like certain spices and things like that, those still have a very low dollar value per hectare, even relative to natural habitats. And mangroves themselves aren't even the most valuable ecosystems on the planet. There are things that are 3 times as valuable per hectare, or 5 times as valuable per hectare as a mangrove. So this is just the baseline in terms of a really good and valuable thing. So so that sets the stage. That's biodiversity. That's how we look at it. That's what it means. But the current rapid decline in biodiversity that we've been discussing is what we call the current biodiversity crisis. And again, I told you this is one of the top, sort of global threats to, our economies and livelihoods and things like that. And scientists actually peg us as being right now in the middle of the 6th mass extinction event on the planet. So before humans came along, we only had 5 extinction events, 5 mass extinction events. The last one was about 65 million years ago when the dinosaurs got wiped out, likely by an asteroid. So that was the last mass extinction. We're currently in the next great mass extinction. So number 6, pushing the number up. And essentially, you got to think about this as annihilation of biology. That's really all it is, right? Humans are doing what we're doing, and this puts a huge burden, a huge pressure on nature. So, and the sort of the wacky and wild thing about this is when you actually start to calculate extinction rates during the Anthropocene, they seem to be about 100 to 1,000 times higher than pre-industrial times. And in terms of like the rate at which we're causing things to go extinct, it actually seems to be higher than any mass extinction before this one. So humans are we're good at killing things. That much is true. So the question we're going to answer for the remainder of this class is, how the hell did we get into this mess? How did we go from awesome really violent, but it's a great acronym. And uh, oh, a second, my video has cut out. Okay, there we go. Yeah, sorry about that. Like I said, it's a Zoom thing for some reason. I don't know why it cuts out. I teach on Blackboard Collaborate as well, and Blackboard Collaborate never cuts out. It's just Zoom. I don't know why. Anyways, so E.O. Wilson, he's a entomologist, so he studies bugs. He works at Harvard. He's a professor emeritus there. He's one of the sort of, you know, best known ecologists of our time. And E.O. Wilson says the decline of Earth's biodiversity is an unintended consequence of multiple factors that have been enhanced by human activity. They can summarize by the acronym HIPPO, which with the order of the letters corresponding to their rank in destructiveness. So HIPPO stands for H, habitat loss, I, invasive species, P, pollution, P, population, and O, overharvesting or overuse. We are going to talk about all these today, but we are going to save pollution to pretty heavily discuss later in the semester as just a whole. And we talked pretty heavily about overharvesting and overuse when we talked about tragedy of the commons, and we also talked about population growth pretty heavily. So we're going to focus mostly on H and I. So hi, uh, and sort of see that now. Just before we move on, I just want to show you sort of the effects of biodiversity loss, and it can be seen pretty starkly between, unfortunately, two of the poorest areas of the Western Hemisphere, and this is the Dominican Republic and Haiti. But you can see people that take something like HIPPO pretty seriously, like the Dominican Republic does. It's beautiful, it's lush, and then you can directly see the border between them, right? And then you see Haiti, with Haiti being far less well off than the Dominican Republic is. But you can see the border between them, not because there's a wall or there's anything like that. It's just because biodiversity is protected. HIPPO is enacted in different ways in different countries. There's different policies. And it's a sad picture, but it's a really effective picture of showing you what preserving biodiversity looks like and what not really giving a crap about biodiversity looks like. So let's talk about habitat loss. We're going to start off with habitat fragmentation. And this is a pretty common thing we see. So you can think of, if you've ever been down to the Boston Common, right? Or the what is it? It's not the Rose Garden. That's the thing at the White House. What is it called? That garden that's next to the common, right? You have these little pockets of natural area, right? The garden is relatively natural, and that's those like little pockets, right? That's what we mean by habitat fragmentation. And so habitat fragmentation is basically breaking a natural habitat into patches that are too small to support a meaningful population size of pretty much anything, right? So if you sort of look at some of these, right, there's a couple examples of habitat fragmentation down here. So we have this clear-cut forest, right? This is a habitat fragmentation. This little piece down here is way too small to support anything meaningful. We can see a road here. It's fragmenting this forest, right? It's cutting it directly in half. And we can also see this seagrass bed here. It's been cut right down the middle by a propeller from a boat. And so we're fragmenting a habitat. You're creating a division, right? You're separating things, or you're creating a habitat that is too small. And so this occurs just because of human development and human activities, right? This road, right, cuts this forest in half. Cutting down this forest leaves patches like this, or potentially cuts out entire segments of a forest, right? And then driving your boat through a seagrass bed can potentially disrupt and cut the seagrass bed completely in half. So this is what we mean by habitat fragmentation. But as you fragment a population, a habitat, it leads to the destruction of that habitat overall, which would lead to extinction. Right? If this is your ecosystem, you can imagine, well, it's not exactly the healthiest thing, right? It's missing what 50% of the ecosystem that we can just see here. Right? You imagine just cutting down a forest leads to the extinction of species, and that's true. It's 100% true. There's actually some pretty cool solutions to this. So our friends in the Netherlands love these, and there's varying levels of these across the world, but there's these habitat corridors, and so sometimes they go underneath or they go over, like you're seeing here with this bridge. Japan, I know, has these cool turtle bridges that like basically like funnel their migrating turtles into like a little escalator, and it just like pushes them across and underneath the road. It's kind of a cool thing. But a possible solution to habitat fragmentation is restoring that and potentially building bridges like this to allow animals to cross, um, and cross, basically deadly barriers such as highways, right? Maybe you don't think about like how, well, you probably do because you've probably seen dead things lying on the road, but highways are a big barrier, and making a safe way to pass, even if it's just a few bridges like this, can be a pretty impactful way to restore connectivity within a habitat. So, and you could also think about potentially something like this study from 2010, where we're looking at a dam, right? It was blocking it was fragmenting a habitat. So these people built a dam to harvest fish from the water, right? That's one of the good things about dams. And so this is what it looked like. And what they did is they installed a pipe to restore connectivity between where they dammed, right? So where they dammed would be on this side, and then the natural habitat was on this side. So they built a pipe, which obviously allows connectivity, allows the water to flow between the two of them, which allows movement of animals. And they restored it, removing that dam, putting that pipe in, and making the ecosystem more connected. So getting rid of that habitat fragmentation. And so you can actually look at the biodiversity um, as both. So P here is a fish pounds produced per year by the creek, just as a note. So that's what's on the y-axis. On the right graph here, and the left graph here is total species. So total species as it goes up. And you can see pre-restoration, there was about 8 species. Post-restoration, there's close to 16 species. So they doubled the amount of species just by restoring the connectivity. And you can see the same thing here for the amount of fish, the poundage of fish. In this case, it's grams, but the amount of fish produced per year. Prior to restoration, 50. After restoration, 200. So double the species, 4 times the amount of fish could be harvested just by restoring connectivity, right? And so if you think about this in an economic sense, right? If you can increase the amount of fish you could pull out of your pond by 4 times, well, it means you could potentially increase your revenue by 4 times. So that's pretty cool, right? Really, really simple thing to do, restoring habitats. Huge return on investment. I will also mention that this idea of restoring flow is something Massachusetts is doing a lot right now. So we're restoring our flow to many of our tidal marshes because they've been like dammed or they've been cut off by roads. So Massachusetts has invested, I think, about 15 or 20 million dollars in the past couple of years restoring tidal flow to our coastal wetlands. And they do this because they expect a return on investment in terms of, fisheries and things like that. But this idea is simple, right? This is just a 10-foot long or 15-foot long pipe, but look at what it reaps for biodiversity and potentially economically. So um, now, in terms of habitat loss, we don't just have fragmentation, we also have land use change. And land use change is simply changing a natural habitat like a forest to something that humans are going to use, right? And this includes cities, food, or just cutting down trees for, just for timber, right? And the conversion of forests and grasslands and savannas um, to these industrial uses, to these things, is a huge thing. So this graph really illustrates things nicely. So we have metric tons and these are our beef, hardwood, and deforestation. And that's I'm sorry, metric tons is in hardwood and beef, sort of production or taking away. And we have deforestation in square kilometers, and these are 10,000, so it's not 30 square kilometers, it's 30,000 square kilometers. Um, and deforestation is in green here. So you can see that we're increasing, not just hardwood production, beef production, but also deforestation. So they go hand in hand. Um, and then you see a pretty precipitous drop in deforestation around 2004. I forget what that's caused by. I apologize. I had it written down and I forgot now. Sorry. But you can see they go hand in hand, right? As you lose forest, as you lose cover, it's because we're doing something to it. We're converting it to something to try to make money off of. Even though the ecosystems are valuable, right? Production of beef is hugely valuable economically, right? Paper is really important, right? We need it for toilet paper. And you saw how what crazy people went with toilet paper earlier this year. That was crazy times. And we're seeing this, I'll just make note because this is happening in huge amounts right now in the Amazon rainforest in Brazil primarily. And we're seeing massive amounts of changes in land use in Brazil for mostly the production of beef um, because the government doesn't really give a crap because they don't, which is just sad. So, but in terms of the Amazon rainforest, the Amazon actually isn't a naturally burning ecosystem. Every ecosystem burns sometime, right? Because fires and things like that. But there are ecosystems that like are built around the idea of burning. So I'm sure you guys have probably heard this about the fires in California. Those ecosystems in the American Northwest are designed to burn every couple years to essentially restart growth. But something like the Amazon rainforest actually isn't supposed to burn. It's a rainforest. It's really, really wet. So it's not really supposed to burn. So we can actually see this is just a map of the Amazon basin, Brazil and Venezuela and Colombia and all these South American countries, not companies. And every time we see a little red dot, you can see that's a fire. So it's detected by satellite. And every time we see purple, it's the areas of the Amazonia prone to burning. So we have red is on fire, purple is burning, or I'm sorry, the potential to burn. And this is data from last year. I couldn't find a more updated figure from this because it's from National Geographic. Um, but I'd like to find a better one than this because it's just worse this year. Let's just point out. So Amazon, it's on fire. That's not just in 2019. That's nowadays too. And this is an ecosystem that wasn't designed to burn. It's a rainforest. It's not like the American Northwest that's designed to burn. And so we're seeing burning happening, and the burning has to come from somewhere. It's not natural burning, it's anthropogenic burning, right? Humans are setting fire to the Amazon rainforest to clear it. Burning something is the easiest way to clear it. So they're burning the Amazon rainforest to clear it, to get the timber, potentially, or they're burning it to mostly grow beef so they can have their cows have a place to live. And so, in just alone in 2018, 2019, the amount of forest burned was the equivalent to the size of New Jersey. New Jersey is not a huge state, but 7,200 square miles is a pretty huge tract of forest. And so in sort of areas like, Amazon Basin, the Congo Basin, burning of forests is a pretty big effect of land use change. Pretty important overall. But in terms of land use change, it's led to some pretty significant biodiversity loss. And so we have in this map of the planet, and it's a really sad map, unfortunately, but we have forest here in green, and we have deforestation fronts and projected deforestation fronts between 2010 and 2030. And you'll notice that the greens and the reds overlap pretty heavily, but you also notice that the greens kind of almost don't outweigh the reds, right? We could see that deforestation rates, especially in, you can look at some place like Australia, right, where there's more deforestation than there is green, right? But green is slowly being replaced by red. And so in terms of what this does to biodiversity, the projected mass extinction event irrespective of all other anthropogenic factors alone, um, um, from in terms of the extinction of tropical forest is going to be essentially the highest, right? A lot of our biodiversity loss is just through the loss of our tropical forests. Because if you sort of remember back to our biodiversity hotspots, a lot of them are in the tropics. And so just the biodiversity loss in these forests is huge. It is huge. Um, and we are losing millions of acres every year. And as we, essentially as we start to degrade them, we don't just lose the species, right? We're not losing the tiger. We're not losing, just elephants and orangutans. We're also degrading the ecosystems. And so you can imagine as I degrade this ecosystem, well, if I relied on this ecosystem for water purification or air purification, I lose that service, which means I lose that value to the economy, that benefit to humans. So it's not just the loss of species, it's the loss that comes along with those things, right? Those four key services that we've been talking about. So that's land use change. It's against the biggest sort of threat that we see in terms of biodiversity loss. Next up is introduced or exotic species. And I like this one because I worked on this when I was a grad student. I worked on this grass here, Phragmites australis, really fascinating grass. Um, I mentioned I'm a microbiologist, and so I worked on the microbiology of this grass. Really cool grass. Now, humans, as we move from place to place, either intentionally or unintentionally, bring species with us. So we accidentally bring pathogenic organisms. We actually accidentally bring seeds with us on accident. But we also bring species like snakes from different parts of the world, and we release them either on purpose or accidentally, right? So it's a pretty common thing. And so when you bring a species to a new geographic region, it becomes exotic. Um, but when you bring something to a new place, and it's considered exotic, it's essentially gets removed from its natural predators, parasites, and pathogens. And as a species that is exotic to an area starts to spread in a given area, it becomes invasive. And invasive species disrupt food webs, they outcompete local biodiversity, and they kind of wreak havoc. And I was going to talk about Phragmites today, but I'm going to actually talk about a much more sexier species, and it's actually the lionfish. Um, and I'm sure you guys have seen the lionfish at some point. They're pretty popular in aquariums. So for people that have saltwater aquariums, these fish, they're not huge. They're like 6 inches or so, but they're really cool looking. They're pretty. They got poisonous spines. So they're pretty popular in aquariums for people who like aquariums. Um, I never could do a saltwater tank. Those are hard to do. I don't know how people do them. Anyways, in the Indo-Pacific, there are 26 species of lionfish, and two species uh, that were essentially identical, so Pteriolus volitans and Pteriolus miles, were introduced to the Atlantic and Caribbean region. So this is actually the world's first invasive fish species that we know of. And so they were first observed in Florida in 1985, but it was potentially earlier. But that's when we first noticed the lionfish coming from this area to Florida. Now you might ask yourself, how the heck did something make it all the way over from India and the China and Australia region all the way across the Pacific Ocean? Right? How did it go 10,000 miles across the planet? Well, the answer to that is humans, right? That's the obvious answer, right? And they're living in our aquariums. They're living in our not just home aquariums, but like aquariums at the zoo and things like that, right? And so people had them in their aquariums. People had them at hotels, right? So they were getting there. In Florida, people do one of two things: they either get hit by a hurricane, and that potentially could lead to that fish making it out, or they release their organism on purpose because they don't want it anymore, or they're moving or something like that. So it is, again, we can either be accidentally introduced by like a hurricane or purposely introduced directly into the wild. But again, it's a species that doesn't exist in Florida and was brought to Florida by us and was released by us. Oh no, my thing's not working. Oh, I had a really cool thing that showed like the eh, you should Google this. I'll post a link to Blackboard. It's a really cool animation because it shows this species just started off, we think, at one point and just exploded to cover huge parts of the Caribbean. So if you got a few minutes later, I'll post a link to Blackboard so you can take a peek at it. But it's a really fun it's not, I guess it's not fun, but it's a really interesting video to see how, um, how this thing spread once it made it here. So the question we should ask is, okay, brand new species, it can't be able to do that well in its new habitat. Well, the reality is when something is invasive and it's meaning it's spreading, it's actually really successful. So there's a lot of characteristics about the lionfish that make it really well adapted to its environment. So let's talk about some of these. And so first, there is numerous introductions, and that's typically pretty common for most species. There's multiple introductions, so there's provides lots of pools of genetic diversity. Typically, invasive species reproduce quickly. So, for instance, the lionfish can reproduce every couple months. But if you have something like a rabbit, right? When rabbits were introduced to Australia, they reproduce every 3 weeks or so. So they have to reproduce rapidly. They produce large numbers of eggs or large numbers of offspring. So these are going to be our selected species, right? They reproduce very fast, high amounts of offspring output. They have very long, in case of the lionfish, they have very long pelagic larval phases, which means they kind of hang around in the ecosystem for a while before they make it to adulthood. And because they can hang around, they're kind of hard to get rid of because it's really hard to get rid of larvae of fish. It's easier to get rid of big fish, but it's really hard to get rid of larvae. They are habitat and diet generalists. They eat anything and they live anywhere. They don't really care what they eat, but many species do care what they eat and they do care what they live. So the Florida manatee, for instance, is not a habitat or diet generalist. It likes to live in specific areas. It likes to eat specific things. That's completely in contrast to our lionfish. They have no native predators or no prey, so nothing to keep them in check. They have no known diseases in their invasive range. In their natural range, they do, but in their invasive range, those diseases don't exist. They grow really fast, so they grow. Once they make it to adulthood, they grow really, really fast. They have venomous spines both on their dorsal, ventral, and pelvic areas, which means if something wanted to eat them, they try to eat them, they would get poisoned, right? They'd get bit, and then they'd probably kill the thing. The toxin from these things is pretty nasty. They do have novel behaviors that the animals in the Florida Everglades and the Caribbean have never seen before. They actually blow jets of water to disorient prey, and that's kind of a jarring thing if you've never seen it before as an animal. If you have a few minutes, it's kind of fun to watch these things blow water at things. So if you can find a YouTube video of it, I highly recommend it. And they have all sorts of crazy physiological adaptations. So the lionfish can basically live in fresh water. It's a marine organism, but it has all these crazy physiology to it that allows it to live pretty much anywhere. So there's a lot of these things that are unique. Some of these things are unique to the lionfish, including pelagic and these novel behaviors and stuff like that. But many of these characteristics are pretty consistent across all invasive species. And it doesn't really matter if it's a plant or animal. They share these things pretty heavily in common. And you might ask yourself, why do I care about one species making it in? Well, as you saw, they have all these characteristics that allow them to spread rapidly, allows them to essentially reproduce quickly and generate huge amounts of population. And so by exploding their population, they're directly competing with the natural biodiversity, potentially, outcompeting them for resources or consuming them directly. And it's potentially hazardous to humans because I mentioned that they're poisonous. So some people are very allergic to their venom. So it's a hazard to humans. But ultimately, they're disrupting ecosystems. They're taking nutrients and space and things away from natural things. And you can imagine if you have something like the lionfish that's really successful, well, it might have caused other things to go locally extinct because they just can't keep up with this lionfish. And again, these are pretty common set of characteristics for invasive species. They just come in, they wreak havoc. They're typically better adapted than what is living there naturally. But the reality of all invasive species is we still don't completely know. We really don't really quite know. We predict a lot of things that happen, but the true extent of what they do to our ecosystems is really unknown. Right? Ecosystems are hard to study. They're big. So the true effects of the lionfish, we don't quite understand yet, but we do know that they put a lot of pressure on local biodiversity. So next up in terms of our threats to biodiversity, we have overexploitation, and we've talked about this relative to tragedy of the commons, but human harvesting of wild plants and animals, both terrestrial and aquatic, at rates that exceed the populations or exceed the carrying, exceed the capacity of a population to replenish its population, essentially it impedes the ability of those species to essentially rebound. And animals that have really low reproductive rates, such as the rhino, are particularly vulnerable, as are many other large species, elephants, big cats, things that have very low reproductive output, are really susceptible to overexploitation. But you can also see this really sad place where we have shark finning, right? They catch sharks and they just cut the fins off, and then they throw the sharks back. And if you cut the fin off a shark, it dies. Right? So just taking what we need, because to hunt a rhino, people pay tens of thousands of dollars. Shark fins, people pay lots of money for the potential and non-existent medicinal properties that they think exist in shark fins. So overexploitation, again, tied directly to that tragedy of the commons, it's a big push on our planet. Climate change, which we're going to spend a lot of time talking about later in the semester, does have a really heavy impact on our species. And this is a two-way street. So climate change alone is expected to threaten 25% of all species by 2050. So that's just one thing. That's going to be the biggest push. But climate change currently is actually already forcing biodiversity to adapt, so causing things to shift their ranges, change their life cycles and physical traits. But there is this two-way street, as I mentioned, that biodiversity, preserving biodiversity might actually help mitigate climate change. And we'll talk about this idea of climate change and biodiversity loss later on in the semester when we talk about climate change for a couple classes and activities. But the question being, sorry, my dog just came over and he decided he had to fart on me, and it smells really bad here now. Sorry. So the question being is, we've talked about all these bad things, right? Shark fins, terrible. Destruction of habitats, terrible. But how do we reduce biodiversity loss? It ultimately comes down to conservation. And conservation is just caring and protecting resources for future generations. And how do we do this? Well, the Endangered Species Act has showed us that regulation can be very powerful. And that's going to be ultimately our best weapon to fight biodiversity loss, just regulating things. I know the world of economics hates regulation. I know half the world hates regulation, but regulation is a good thing. Regulating things at the level of laws and bills is the best sort of method we have. But other things that we could think about doing are having zoos and aquariums, and there are ethical issues associated with these, and I understand those, but zoos and aquariums provide up close looks at biodiversity, and that's important. People don't care about something until it physically happens to them and they can physically see it, right? People that for instance, like the coronavirus shows this very well. Some people thought the coronavirus was a hoax until they got it, or until someone they knew got it. And so putting something directly in people's face, like a zoo and an aquarium does, is a great way to get people to care about polar bears, get them to care about tigers, and so on and so forth. The biggest one is just protecting habitats and restoring habitats, trying to bring habitats back after we've degraded them. And then again, this goes into a legislative thing. Potentially keeping seed banks, gene banks, and pollen banks, so keeping repositories of genetic information, or repository of seeds, or repository of pollen, to potentially bring back species after they've gone extinct. And these banks sort of tie into this idea of the passenger pigeon, right? I discussed people are trying to genetically engineer the rock pigeon to bring back the passenger pigeon from the dead. So that's other possibilities. But sort of a couple of final notes before we end this. E.O. Wilson, again, our friend, the super duper awesome ecologist, he proposed this idea of the half Earth. And he says, to save biodiversity, we need to set aside about half the Earth's surface as a natural reserve. I'm not suggesting that we have one hemisphere for humans and the other for the rest of life. I'm talking about allocating up to one half of the surface of the land and the sea as a preserve for the remaining flora and fauna. And the question you should ask is how, and is it possible? And the answer to is it possible is yeah, it's easily possible. There's plenty of land. There's plenty of ocean. It is definitely possible. But what we're talking about is protecting half of what's already still there. So protecting large parts of the Amazon basin, the Congo basin, New Guinea, biodiversity hotspots, creating habitat corridors, and stopping pelagic fisheries and things like that. So protecting things overall. And so it's a really good idea to do, but ultimately it just comes down to conserving what we have, because once it's gone, it's really not coming back. We're not going to Jurassic Park this, right? We're not going to bring stuff back from the dead. That's not really a feasible thing. What we need to do is protect what we have, because once it's gone, it's really gone. So sort of as just a couple last things, there's some pretty big news that's come out lately about how much we've lost, and I wanted just to talk about a few of these really interesting things that have come out. So here's a really interesting paper that I'm going to talk about just briefly here. And so in this new synthesis in the journal Cell, the scientists estimate that 58.4% of all the land is under moderate to severe human pressure, with places including the tropics and Southeast Asia leading the way. So that's a lot of area, right? 58% of our land is under severe to moderate human pressure. Between 2000 and 2013, we lost 1.9 million kilometers of land because it got heavily modified by us. It's a lot of land. That's basically like the size of Mexico. It's huge. Now, you can sort of look at this is from that paper, and it's a really really good paper if you have, you know, half hour or so to read it. But we have the scale of the planet. So red is highly modified, green is very low modified, and like the very dark greens is no modification. It's intact basically, and you can see all these you can see the sort of the planet being shaded, and most of the planet's on fire, right? Most of the planet has been heavily modified, right? That's that 58%. But you can also see how different habitats are being impacted differently, right? So you can look at things like mangroves. They're doing pretty bad, right? Most of them are pretty heavily impacted, right? But you can also look at things like the tundra, right? The very cold areas of the world. They're doing pretty good, right? So it is variable, right? But it is pretty concentrated where humans live, and I think it's no better. I think it's no better illustrated in Southeast Asia, where it's basically all on fire, right? Where you have basically this part of the world where 1/3 of the human population lives, and it's pretty heavily destroyed. And again, it's just humans pressing on our ecosystem. So again, if you have a few minutes, this is a really sort of really good paper that gets at what the current estimates of biodiversity loss, and habitat loss, which is it's really massive. And so I mentioned, the UN monitors this. Did we hit any trajectories that we set out for ourselves? And the realities of it is not even close. So we've been setting out trajectories and goals for ourselves to sort of mitigate biodiversity loss, but we haven't even come close to hitting them. And so this report from the UN, I have 3 articles for you here if you want to take a peek at it. But I like this quote. It says, global wildlife populations are in free fall, plunging by 2/3 because of human overconsumption, population growth, and intensive agriculture. In total, 2/3 of the world's wildlife has been wiped out in the past 50 years. And that's sad. Now, on a better note, a brand new study in Nature, which is a really good journal. And again, if you have half hour, it's a great paper to read. A new study in Nature has shown that we can actually tackle this issue of biodiversity with some key changes to society. And these are things that you would imagine: sustainable agriculture, reduced agricultural intensity, reduced food waste. And this reduced food waste we're going to talk about a lot in climate change and the waste part of this course. Reducing beef consumption, eating more plant-based diets, and more ecosystem protection and restoration. Things that aren't exactly hard to do, but I think the top 2 are just about changing the way we grow food. And given how heavily subsidized our agriculture is, this might be easier to do than we think. Reducing food waste, that's a tough one. People are wasteful. The average American wastes every year like 1/3 of the food you buy. It's absurd. So that's a personal choice as a note. Reducing beef consumption is hard because some people are super attached to their beef. I'll admit, I like a good steak or a burger every now and then. But it's reducing beef consumption is a big thing because remember, beef consumption isn't just tied to climate change; it's tied to land use changes as well. And ecosystem protection and restoration, not that costly to do, right? Remember the Florida Everglades, not that much money to do it. $11 billion is not a lot to restore that huge ecosystem. And so these things are doable. They just have to be done. And that's sort of the thing. They have to be done. They have to be recognized as a problem, and they have to be recognized as fixes for us to do them. And so back to this question of where we started, why protect a polar bear? Well, protecting a polar bear on its own might not seem like a big deal, but the polar bear itself is a symptom of biodiversity. Big animals are the most susceptible to biodiversity loss, to habitat change, to invasive species. So you protect the polar bear because it's easy to see, it's easy to track, it's easier to monitor. So you protect a polar bear not because they're adorable, which they obviously are, but you protect a polar bear because they are essentially they're a good way to see how the ecosystem is doing. When the polar bears are declining, that means your ecosystem is also declining as well. So for your activity for the day, you don't have to stay here to do this, but you're going to hop on over to the IUCN Red List. You're going to select one plant species and one animal species and let me know what its IUCN status. And based upon the IUCN information provided and your own online research, and mostly from what you've seen in this class, what are some of the related ecosystem services that these species may help support? So that is what you're going to do. You're going to mosey on, mosey on over to Blackboard. You're going to go to discussion board here, and you are going to post the answer to those things here. So you're just going to click on the discussion board and click create thread. And you're going to do this. You're just going to post your animals, or so your animal and your plant, and tell me about it. Tell me about its ecosystem services. Tell me about its IUCN status. It's not a super long activity, but I want you to find something that interests you from that red list and write about it. Because again, the best way to preserve biodiversity is to get people to care about it. And by you guys, I'm not saying that you guys don't care about biodiversity, but learning all about a cool animal on that list, maybe something you've never heard, will give you a greater appreciation of why we should protect it and overall, sort of the issues surrounding it. So that's going to be the end of our biodiversity class. And so that leads nicely into you thinking about your laboratory, right? You're going to assess biodiversity. You're going to have your human impacted site, and you're going to have your natural sites, right? And you're going to make that comparison. You're going to look at the biodiversity, how many species you have there, and see how they differ in the presence and the absence of us pesky humans, because we are pesky, as you've seen. Sorry for the gloom and doom lecture. A lot of our lectures are gloom and doom because the reality is the state of biodiversity, the state of climate change, the state of conservation, the state of all these things that we're talking about is bad right now. And that's an unfortunate thing. I think that's why climate change has really taken a long time to become a central issue because, we had it in the vice presidential debate last night, and that's the first time it's really ever made it into a major debate in this country. And it's been a topic for 30 years now. So gloom and doom is not sexy. But what is sexy? Polar bears. So I'm going to stop recording now.